All right, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Django and the Django ORM particularly. In part one, we'll be going over a high-level overview of Django, what we will be building, Python virtual environments, handling dependencies, installing and creating a Django project, creating a Django application, connecting Django to Postgres, and creating a model and migrations, the Django console, and creating a model instance. I know that sounds like a lot, but as we'll see here shortly, it all kind of blends in together, and you can't really do one without the other. In part two, we'll be expanding on models and fields. We'll be covering what are fixtures, updating a model, creating a second instance of our model, what's the commonalities between models and object-oriented programming concepts that we've learned so far, the Django admin site, and creating a super user. At this point, does anyone have any questions over the topics that we'll be covering today? All right, doesn't seem like there are any questions, so let's go ahead and move into our high-level overview. So this is going to be Django. This is what we'll be talking about for the next couple of weeks. Looks like a lot, all right? And what we're going to be mainly focusing today on will be our Django application, our models, and how those models can relate to PostgreSQL. So we'll be focusing here, Django app, talking to a model, and then going over to PostgreSQL. Now, if we take a look at our higher level overview here on backend breakdown, we have our Django API, which at the end of this project, we'll be creating a Pokey API, which will be making a mimic of the Pokey API. So we'll have the Django API here at the very top, which is our project. Within our project, we'll have a or multiple apps. Each app will be dedicated towards one model, and that one model will connect to PostgreSQL. We'll be covering everything else in the following days, but today our main focus will be the Django apps and the models. All right. I don't want to go too far in depth into everything else that's here because it's just going to confuse us if we start talking about it now. So let's go ahead and dive into our lesson for the day. So this is Django. So what is Django and why use it? Django is a backend framework that is built with Python and utilizes a WSGI to turn that Python code into server code, something that can be utilized for other programs to connect to it, send HTTP requests, and receive HTTP responses. All right. Now, the Django ORM is one of the biggest things that stands out as to why you would choose utilizing Django. The Django ORM, it stands for Object Relational Mapping, right? Not operational risk management, but object relational mapping. So that just means I want to create an object, which is an instance of a class, right? We've all already talked about objects. It's just a class instance. Now that class is going to have a relation, and then the mapping portion stands for how it connects to the database. Each object or each class, as is represented within Django, will be represented as a data table within PostgreSQL or whatever database it is that we're trying to utilize. Typically, you would want to use some sort of relational database with Django. You don't want to utilize something like that doesn't have a relational database. It could cause some unexpected behavior. You definitely can. It just takes a little bit of extra work to make it work correctly for you. Now, we'll talk about the RESTful API capabilities for Django. Django has a very dynamic URL framework. It has a lot of reinforcements that it can provide for you. We covered Flask in our last lesson, and we talked about what was missing from Flask in order to make our... I apologize, everyone. My dogs are going crazy. I'm going to go ahead and pause this recording and take them inside. All right, so we just talked about the RESTful API capabilities. Other than that, it is very versatile and it is portable. It comes with batteries included. Django comes with a lot of the things that we as developers are going to need in order to make a full API or say fully RESTful API. Since Django knows that that's our end intent, it already has some tools provided for us so that we don't have to build them out from scratch. Eventually, you want to get to the point where you would want to build these tools from scratch to be able to meet your specific requirements, depending on what kind of project it is that you're working on. And other frameworks will force you to build them out from scratch because they won't have them for you. So for us, the right tool to utilize now will be Django. Does anyone have any questions about why Django? All right, moving on. So let's talk about virtual environments real quick. Can somebody read this slide, please?
Virtual environments are containers that wrap around your project to ensure that whatever you install inside your virtual environment stays there and doesn't affect the rest of your computer.
All right, perfect. So what exactly does that mean? Whenever you create a virtual environment, it's kind of reinforcing the idea of a virtual machine, but not to the full extent of actually creating an entire machine for you. That virtual environment is going to keep track of any sort of installments that you have. So rather than installing things into your local machine, it will install it into that environment. And only that environment will keep track of those dependencies. Without that environment being activated, those dependencies won't be within your project. You'll have to activate the environment in order to be able to access all of the previously installed dependencies that you have, and then be able to run your projects. Now, why would you want to keep track of your dependencies rather than installing them into your machine and then develop your project? Can anyone think of a scenario where you would want to keep track of dependencies? Go ahead, James.
Maybe if you wanted to share it and someone else to clone it, then they'd have a way to see those dependencies.
Perfect. Yeah. So let's say I'm working on several projects. We're within a consulting development team, and we work for different companies. We make different websites, and we're utilizing Django as a backend framework for each one of them. Well, each one of those projects won't necessarily have the same dependencies. Some of them could be using different versions of Python. As Python gets updated, we could be messing with Python 2. Maybe that we needed something that Python 3 no longer has, but Python 2 still did. Well, sorry, am I getting a question? Or was that a hot mic? I'll go with hot mic. All right. So in order to keep track of those dependencies and make sure that a project can always attain those specific dependencies, we use virtual environments. And that's very similar to a package JSON, right? In our package JSON, we kept track of our dependencies for each individual NPM project that we created. Well, our virtual environment is going to do that for us. All right. Does anyone have any questions about virtual environments? Okay, well, if no one has any questions, let's go into a little bit of our setup process. Let's create a virtual environment within our nodes here. All right, so here is my nodes. I'm within my correct directory. I'm in intro to Django ORM, but I want to create a virtual environment. And you're going to utilize Python-m virtual environment, and then I'm going to name it .v. All right, that dot is for me to know that this is a virtual environment, and then I'm going to name it virtual environment. There's no specific naming convention. You want to name it something like environment, or if you have some other naming convention within your own developing group, then you could also do that, or for yourself. But you could create this virtual environment utilizing this command. And now when I run this command, we'll see that I got a directory named .vnv. And inside this directory, I have a couple of things. So include, it tells me that the only thing currently in here is Python 3.11. It tells me a couple of other tools that I have. I have pip, and I have some setup tools that I can take a look at, but I'm really not going to. I need to know that I have pip. I need to know that I have Python. And within my bin, I need to know that there is an activate script. So let's see what happens when I run pip, or sorry, when I run source.venv/bin/activate. So I am telling VS Code that what it's going to utilize as a source of truth or as a source for environment will be the virtual environment /bin, and I'm going to run that activate script. So let's take a look at the activate script. It looks like that activate script is setting a couple of commands within Bash as to where it's going to be handling all of my information and where it should be storing my dependencies. So now when I run this command, I see these parentheses on the left-hand side along with this .venv. And that lets me know that I am within my virtual environment. All right, we'll stop there. Go ahead, Jens.
So you said that source.venv line there is how VS Code now knows that this is where to look at. Is that because you're doing this from the VS Code terminal, or could you have done this?
Go ahead.
Oh no, did you say that's correct? It's specifically because you're doing this from this terminal?
Yeah, it's specifically because I'm doing it from this terminal. If I were using it from any other terminal, or even if I open up another terminal instance, you can see that that .venv is no longer on the left-hand side, right? Anytime I want to utilize that virtual environment within a terminal instance, right, within any of my terminal, even if it's my iTerm or just my shell within WSL, I would have to manually activate it. Otherwise, it will not be activated, and my dependencies wouldn't fall into the correct project setup. Does that answer your question yet?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right. So now we have our virtual environment activated. Before we keep going, let's go back to our slideshow and take a look at a couple of things regarding setup. So regarding setup, it is very important that we do not repeat ourselves, right? We want to make sure that we always keep, there's two concepts that we're going to repeat a lot. And that's, I always tell myself, as you know, Marines have a lot of acronyms, or I'm pretty sure the whole entire military has a lot of acronyms. But I think of dry syrup, right? So don't repeat yourself, and then single responsibility principle. Those are the two things that I want to make sure that we always keep in mind whenever we're creating apps, models, or functions. So we're creating an app, we must ensure to apply the dry concept in each and every app and function. An app should be fully dedicated to one purpose and one purpose only. And generally that purpose is a reflection of its main model. All right, well, we'll see what that means here shortly. And let's talk about the folder structure. So here's the Django folder structure. When setting up your Django project and applications, try to keep principles of OOP in mind. All right, so we have one project, and that one project will be the parent of many apps. Now, each one of these apps should have one model within them. It could have additional models if they really don't require a lot of work, but you preferably want to keep it into a 1-to-1 ratio. One app, one model. And we'll see why. Everything will be simple when we're creating just models, but as that project starts growing and we start applying API views, serializers, validators, and adding a bunch of other things into this one app, we'll see how that one app can easily get out of hand if we had multiple models within it. So please try to keep your apps to one model. Here's another example, right? So here's the Django folder structure. We have our ice cream fridge, which is essentially our project, right? And within each project, there is one tub of ice cream. And that one tub of ice cream is one specific app. So let's go ahead and create our app. So we already went over creating a virtual environment, but now how do we create our Django application? Well, first, you realize that we probably don't have the latest version of pip. So if I run pip install Django, and I run that command, it's going to install Django successfully. So we can see that Django has been installed, but then it tells me, hey, there's a new release of pip available. Currently, you have 23.0.1, and we're all the way to 24.0. Please upgrade your pip. So I could just copy and paste this command of pip install -- upgrade pip, and that will upgrade my pip. Now, just to make sure that pip installed the correct dependencies for Django, I'm going to run pip install Django one more time. Okay. So Django worked great. All my requirements were satisfied. I have the correct information. Well, now let's take a look at what I have here within bin. Well, notice that bin isn't any longer just pip, Python, and activate. Now I have a Django admin script. All right. Let me see what else I have here. In lib, we can see that I have Python 3.11, and the site packages say that I have this ASGIRF, Django, some other dependency that falls with Django. The Django installing Django, rather than being stored in my local machine, it's being stored within this virtual environment. And that's how I keep track of my dependencies now. Okay, that's great. I've been able to install Django into my virtual environment. But now, how do I create a project? Well, there's two ways of creating a project. We can see here, creating a Django project, and I have this period or a question mark. Well, let's go into Python, or excuse me, it's going to be Django admin, start project, and I'm going to name it Pokey API. And actually, I'm going to name it Pokey project. Pokey API proj. There you go. Well, when I run this, we're going to see an entire directory being created named Pokey API _ project. And within this directory, we'll see a nested project saying Pokey API _ project that has all of my project files, which we'll be covering here shortly. And other than that, I have a manage.py script. Okay, great. So there's one way of creating my project. I created a parent directory that will hold my entire project within. All right, I'm going to go ahead and delete this parent directory that's holding my entire project within it. And now I'm going to run the same command, Django admin start project, the Pokey API project. But instead of just running that command, I'm going to place a period at the end. Now, when I place a period at the end, I am telling it to create this project within the current directory that I'm in. So rather than creating a parent project and then inside of it having my actual project and applications, it's going to make it within the current directory that I'm in. So now when I run it, we can see that I get a Pokey API project with all of my files within it and a manage.py, all in the same level as the parent directory where I executed this command. And those are the two methods for creating a project. Now within this Pokey API project, I have an ASGI file, which you can utilize to connect to sockets, which we won't be covering here in Code Platoon. And settings.py. Settings.py will be the main directory for your entire project. Before you run anything, or every time you run any command that has to do with your Django project, it will check your settings first. And they'll make sure that your settings is set up correctly for you to execute any commands. We'll go over into setting up our settings to connect to PostgreSQL and connect to our separate applications. Now, our WSGI, that's used during deployment purposes. And our WSGI is what's going to connect us to G-Unicorn so that we can actually deploy our application and have some sort of server that's able to accept and return HTTP requests at a higher level concept rather than running on our local machine. Now, for us in the development process, what's important will be our settings.py and our URLs.py. We went a little bit in depth in Flask. You can see that in settings, I can specify installed apps. This debug equals true should seem familiar, right? We just like when we ran our Flask server, we have to say, hey, this is going to be true. And this allowed host, it simply says, well, which hosts are allowed to connect to this project. In our database, we can see that it specifies an engine and it says which engine it should be using, where that directory should be living, and where it should create the file for SQLite. There's a couple of other things here which we'll be covering as we move through the program. But note that the important thing here is going to be our database portion and our installed apps. That's what we'll be focusing into today. Our URLs, well, when we covered Flask, we would use a decorator to establish our URL patterns. Now we're not going to be doing it that way. Instead, we'll be actually establishing a list of URL patterns that will connect to each individual application and trigger an independent function. And then finally, we have our manage.py script. Our manage.py script, the entire purpose for it is so that every time I need to do something to this project, I reference the manage.py script of the project. It will check my Django settings. If my Django settings are good, then it's going to execute the command depending on which one of the commands it is that I'm trying to use, which we'll cover here shortly. All right, that was quite a bit that we just covered. Does anyone have any questions regarding virtual environments, how to create a Pokey API project or a Django project, and how to set up our settings or manage PY? Go ahead, George.
I had a question about the way you created the project. I know there's another way of creating it. Why did you choose to use the Django tech admin?
Sorry, could you say it one more time?
I know there's two ways of creating a project. I was just wondering, why did you choose the way with the Django tech admin?
Okay, so two ways of creating a project, and I'm assuming you were referencing to the Python way of creating a project. They're both doing the same exact thing. When I run python-m Django, it's actually going to look within my virtual environment. It's going to take a look at bin, and it's going to find the script for Django admin. And then it's going to execute this script, which is the same one that I used to actually create my project. The only thing that I'm skipping is rather than utilizing Python to map through my dependencies and find this Django script, I'm utilizing the script from the very start by calling Django admin and then telling it to start a project. Does that answer your question, George?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, you mentioned I guess it was WSGI. Can you just go over that one more time, exactly what that does?
Yeah, definitely. So our WSGI, what it exactly does is it works kind of as an interpreter or as a connector. Yeah, I want to call it a connector. So what it does is we're going to be running a separate server when we go into deployment, or typically when you go into deployment, you don't ever want to utilize the same servers that come with this frameworks. Vite, we won't be able to run our React applications within our Vite server. We'll be utilizing something called Nginx to render our front-end application. And our backend framework, we can't just utilize our Django server to be able to host our information online. I mean, you can, but you shouldn't. Instead, you'll be utilizing a WSGI network, which G-Unicorn is what will be provided for us. Now, G-Unicorn is just a server that's looking for an application that it's supposed to essentially utilize the code of that application to be able to run it and trigger a function. Now, in order for that to happen, it needs to have a way to connect to said application. So this WSGI file when it's executed, it's going to take in where it is looking to connect to or what it is looking to connect to. And when we go into deployment, we'll specify that it's going to be connecting with GUnicorn and a specific port. And if GUnicorn is tracking that it's supposed to connect to this file as well, they'll accept their connection. And then rather than our Django application receiving the request, it will be GUnicorn that receives the request and triggers our Django application. But we'll be going into that further in deployment. Does that answer your question, Nathan?
Yeah, kind of. So it's more like a deployment server rather than like a development server.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yams?
Just touching on that GUnicorn, is that built in or is that something we'll have to install later?
Yeah, that's definitely not built in. It's something that we'll install later once we're inside of our deployment virtual machine. Okay, perfect. So we've covered Python virtual environments, handling dependencies, and installing creating an application. But are we truly handling our dependencies so far? Well, let's take a look at our slideshow here. Let me make sure that it's somewhere in here. Okay, so it's not. So before we move into the Django ORM, I want to go over how exactly we are going to be handling our dependencies. So we've created this .venv file folder, but you don't necessarily want to push a virtual environment folder into GitHub or anywhere else. Just like we don't push the package lock JSON into GitHub, you don't want to push your virtual environment into GitHub. Instead, you want to create something that would mimic the package.json. So .venv would be equivalent to a package lock JSON. So let me go ahead and make that here. So .venv would be equivalent to a package-lock.json. And a requirements.txt is what is going to resemble the package.json. So now this requirements.txt will have the top level headers of what it is that we need to install, just like package.json did. Let's take a look at one of our old applications. Let me make sure that we understand that comparison. So here's our package.json, and it has all of these dependencies. But these dependencies aren't actually being tracked. It even has some of our dev dependencies, right? What's actually tracking them is our package lock JSON. In our package lock JSON, we can scroll down and find each individual one of the dependencies that we created. I'm not going to go through that whole process of finding each one, but this is where all of our actual projects dependencies live. We'll notice that this never gets pushed up to GitHub because we have a .gitignore. And that .gitignore stops us from being able to push that package lock JSON up there. So how do I make that same behavior happen within my project down here? Jesus, there you go. So what I'm going to run is a command named pip freeze. Pip is tracking all of my dependencies. And what I wanted to do is freeze or paste all of its current dependencies into a file. That arrow means this is where I want you to store all of my dependencies. And I'm simply just going to pass a command or a named requirements.txt. Now, if we pay attention to my folder structure here on my left-hand side, when I execute this command, a file named requirements.txt will be created. Okay, so we can see requirements.txt has been created. And when I click on it, well, here's everything that's currently stored within my virtual environment. And it seems like it has everything not only stored within my virtual environment, it looks like it's tracking everything that's also stored within my local machine. So there's some unexpected behavior that I'm getting here. We'll have to clear this up, but you should only get what's inside of your virtual environment, not everything that's inside of your machine as well. All right. So now when I go and push this up to GitHub and other people clone it, they can install all of the dependencies that are within this file. Well, how do I install the dependencies that are within that file? You're going to utilize a command saying pip install. You can't just run requirements.txt because requirements.txt doesn't have one specific command, or it's not just one package that you're installing, all right? Instead, you have to utilize the -r flag to be able to install everything within requirements.txt. So what this command is going to do is it's going to run pip install, and it's going to go from top to bottom. So it'll say pip install AI OHTTP, then it'll pip install AI O signal, and it'll continue working all of its way down recursively, right? Meaning that it's happening over and over again until all of my requirements are installed within my environment. Does anyone have any questions about handling dependencies? Nathan?
Yeah, so is that make the git ignore file already, or is that requirements kind of already set up for git ignore?
That's a great question. So the git ignore should be ignoring my .venv, right? We're not going to go into .git ignore later. We'll go into how to create our .git ignore file once we start covering API keys and how we should handle API keys. I believe that's in lesson 5 or 6. But we'll be creating our own git ignore. It has not been made yet, and it is not being handled as of now. Does that answer your
Gotcha.
question? Of
Yes, thank you.
course. Go ahead, Nika.
So is it okay for me to think of that command you put in with pip freeze to requirements.txt? Is it okay for me to think of it as like we're taking a Polaroid and we're putting it in a box? Or is that not a good way of looking at it?
We're taking a what again?
A Polaroid, like a picture.
Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy, right? I'm taking a Polaroid picture of all of my current dependencies, and I'm storing it in a box, which is requirements.txt. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Of course. All right, great. So we just went over handling dependencies, but let's start talking about the Django ORM. So intro to Django ORM. What does that look like? Well, Django ORM, the lesson objective here is going to be, we're going to build our first Django project, an app. We're going to create a model that will emulate a data table, and then we'll sync our Django models with PostgreSQL. And here we have a small kind of demonstration of everything that's going here. We have Django plus PostgreSQL, and then we've seen this icon before here on the right-hand side. That's psycopg. And again, psycopg is what allows my Python code to talk to SQL code. All right. So here's our commands. I'm going to go ahead and pip install psycopg binary. I'm going to create a database. I'm going to change my database name and settings. I will then create an app model. And then I will start making migrations and migrate. Pretty simple, but let's go a little bit more in depth into what's going on there once we start building our code. So it's going to say we created our model, but currently our database has no idea our model exists, and Django has no idea our database exists. We can specify the database existence and relation in settings.py and utilize psycopg to communicate with PostgreSQL. Okay, and there's a pretty good example here. We can there's that Spider-Man meme. We can see our table on the left-hand side where we have a student, we have an ID, name, email, and good student, where the ID is the primary key. Well, on the right-hand side, we can see that there's no field for ID. It is assumed. When I run this or execute this code, it will create an ID entry for me. The name will be a models.char field. The email will be a models.email field. And notice that now I have an email field. Postgres doesn't have an email field, but Django does, because Django knows that you're going to want that you're going to need that whenever you're going to create users or a student, or that it's something that comes very handy to have. Well, that's one of those batteries included kind of relationships. And then we have our good student, which is just a Boolean field that defaults to true. Okay, great. Well, let's go into putting this into some actual application. So here I have my Poke API. And again, what I want to end up with is a mimic of the actual Poke API. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create an app, and I'm going to name it Pokemon app, because where I want to start is the Pokemon itself. So currently I'm within my virtual environment. I'm in the right directory, and I know I'm with the right directory because I can access manage.py. So I'm going to say Python manage.py start app Pokemon app. And now we can see a new directory has been created named Pokemon app. Well, here's the magic. Not only did I create a new directory named Pokemon app, but look at all the files that come with it. I have an admin file, which we'll see what it does here shortly. I have something called apps, which seems to have a Pokemon app config. So there's a configuration file for this app specifically. I have this models file, and it tells me, hey, create your models here. So anything belonging to this Pokemon, I want to make sure that the model goes within my models.py. Then I have test. I can write test for my Django application that will be executed to check that my models are being built properly and that everything works. Not only my models, but my API views and serializers. And then finally, I have views. Well, we saw earlier, we have URLs in Flask. If I go into our Flask server that we created the other day, we have a URL, and that URL, when triggered, would trigger a function. Well, this function is named a view. And that's the same thing that we'll be creating here in Django later on. All right. So there's my Pokemon model. How do I create this model here? Well, I'm going to start by creating a class instance. Just like in Flask, everything that is a model will be a class. And I'm going to name it models.model. Now, this models.model is what tells my Python code that this is supposed to make an entry into my database as a table. Well, now I'm going to create a name, which will be a models.char field. And I can specify something like max length. And let's just make my max length, I don't know, maybe 50. Hopefully there's no Pokemon with a longer name than 50. And then we could do something like level, which will be a models.integer field. And maybe I could give it a default value here where I make it 1. So there you go. I've created a Pokemon model. Now I haven't created a database or anything. This Pokemon model just exists within Python code. If I try to execute this code, it's not going to run properly because I haven't connected everything yet. So let's go into connecting 1, my app into my project, and 2, my project to PostgreSQL. So now, as I mentioned before, inside of my Pokemon project, which one of these files is going to be the first one to get looked at when I execute a command within Django? Go ahead, George.
Wouldn't it be settings.py?
It would be settings. So if I take a look at settings and I start from the very top and I start scrolling down, we've probably already seen it, but I have this section named installed apps. And here's a couple of apps that come built in with Django. So I have this admin app, which I won't necessarily have access to and it won't show up here, but it exists and it comes built in with Django. I have something to handle authentication if I want to create some users. We can see something that creates sessions within each users and a couple of other things that come already pre-built in with Django. But what about my Pokemon app? My Pokemon app isn't included within installed apps. So if I try to access anything within Pokemon app, it's going to fail. And it's going to say, hey, this app doesn't exist within this project. So to add my app, all I need to do is make sure I enter Pokemon app. And I'm going to place a comma at the end because I know that as my project grows, I'm probably going to put more entries here. And if you miss this comma, you get a really weird error. Actually, let's take a look at that error. Don't pay attention to the command that I'm about to run. I just want us to see the error that I get here. Okay, so I get this error and it tells me a bunch of things, and it tells me no module named Django contrib static files Pokemon app exist. Now, because I've seen this error so many times before, I know that that's referencing to a missing comma within installed apps. But if I wasn't familiar with the Django framework, I would probably think that there's something within Pokemon app that's supposed to work with Django contrib static files, and I would have gone down a rabbit hole that I didn't need to. All right, so please make sure that you always have a comma at the end so that you can execute commands properly. All right, so there you go. I have my Pokemon app. Everything has been connected, and Django now knows about the existence of my Pokemon app, which means it knows about the existence of my model. All right. So what's the next thing? The next thing is I have to connect my project itself to PostgreSQL. If I scroll down here, I can see this database part, and it has this default acronym or this default key. So this is where my database will default to. Well, the engine that I wanted to run in will work with Django. It will work as a database with the backend framework, but I don't want to utilize SQLite. Instead, I want to utilize PostgreSQL. All right, just like with my URI, I had to specify that I'm utilizing PostgreSQL. Well, here, I have to tell Django that it's going to be talking to a PostgreSQL database. And now the name part should be pretty simple. I could just name it Pokemon underscore DB. Actually, I'm going to do Poke API underscore DB. So there's my database. Well, what am I missing here? How does my Python code talk to SQL? Or how will I be able to communicate back and forth with Python code and SQL? There's one dependency what I'm missing. Can anybody tell me what that dependency is? Go ahead, Tom.
Did we install a CyclePG?
Yeah, perfect. I need to make sure that I pip install psycho PG binary. Okay, so now PsychoPG has been installed within my virtual environment. My virtual environment should now be tracking about the existence of PsychoPG. Let me see if I could find it here. It seems like it can't find it. It might be this SQL parse, but it's living within my virtual environment now. Well, now this is created. Everything's working well. And my database of Poke API underscore DB doesn't actually exist yet. Let me take a look here. Let's run PSQL Postgres. And after that, let's run /L so that we can see the different stores that we have. So I see I have a car shop, my game store, Postgres, a student portal, and a workout. All right. So none of that is what I really need it to be. Well, let's go ahead and create database Poke API underscore DB. So that creates my database. I can connect to Poke API underscore DB. Okay, so now I'm within Poke API underscore DB as the user Francisco Avila. But if I try to see any connections or any tables, it tells me that I don't have any relations here. Okay, great. Well, how do I fix that? How do I make this model that we've been talking about before? Oh. How do I make this model appear within my database? Well, in order to do that, I have to do something called migrations. Well, I can see that I have a migrations directory here. And currently it has nothing except for an init.py and a folder named pycache. And this directory named pycache, it's essentially just tracking trash and executable commands. You don't necessarily need your pycache. You're almost always going to put this pycache directories inside of a git ignore so that they don't get pushed into GitHub. All right. So now this migrations directory, it's empty. So how do I place something in there saying that this Pokemon model needs to exist within my database? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a command saying Python manage py make migrations. So this is going to make migration files. So when I execute it, seems like I got an error here. So error loading psychopg2. Okay. Let me go ahead and deactivate my virtual environment and activate it again. I'm going to pip install psychopg binary. Okay, it's telling me that the requirements are already satisfied. But for some reason, when I run this, hold up, DJ, give me a second. This manage py, make migrations, it's looking into the wrong virtual environment, or it's looking into the wrong environment because it's not actually living within my virtual environment. Go ahead, DJ.
I just noticed that it was calling for both psychopg2 and psychopg. I didn't know if it was related to the Flask issue where we had to specify it or some sort of update like that. I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. So the error here is that when I'm running my pip install, it's not going into my virtual environment. I'm not going to go into the whole rabbit hole of fixing this because we don't have that kind of time. So I'm going to deactivate real quick. And I'm going to go ahead and remove this virtual environment. I'm going to create a new one. And hopefully this fixes it. So let's pip install Django. Let's pip install psychopg binary. And there it is. Now it's installing it. Okay, so now I have it working within my virtual environment. Sometimes a good old delete it and then start it again will do the trick. Sometimes it won't. And now let's go ahead and run our make migrations command and continue with our class. All right, so I ran the make migrations command. What exactly happened? It tells me migrations for Pokemon app. And a Pokemon app / migration / 001 initial.py create model. Well, let's take a look at this. All right, so here's my initial PY. It's saying that it's falling within migrations and models. It is a class of migration. It is the initial class, the initial migration being made. It has no dependencies, which makes sense. It's the initial one. And here are the operations that are going to happen within my database. It's going to create a model, which is the same thing as create a table. The name of said table will be Pokemon. I apologize, everyone. Give me a quick second to shut this door real quick. Again, this is going to create a table. The name of said table will be Pokemon. And here are the fields that it's going to be creating. It'll be creating an ID. Again, I never specified that in my model, but it's providing that for me automatically. This ID will be a model, big auto field, and it will be auto created, which is true. The primary key, which is true. And this is going to be a serialized primary key. And we could see this is saying that this will be serialized, which it won't be, right? It doesn't have to do with the serialized primary key of making sure that it increases. It's referencing towards, is the actual ID serialized? Is there a serializer that we're doing to kind of securely store things into our database? And then we have a verbose name there. Then we have our name, which looks almost exactly the same, and a level with a default value. All right. Well, this is my migration, but if I run \d here, I'm still going to see that I have no relationships. So how do I make this migration enter my Django database or the database of Poke API? Well, I'm going to go ahead and say Python manage py. And rather than make migrations, which made my migration file, I'm going to say, I want you to migrate. All right. Well, I ran the migrate command. And when I ran the migrate command, we can see a bunch of things happened, right? So we have a content type, something to do with authentication. These are all the different tables that come default to Django that need to enter my database in order for Django to be able to work correctly. But here at the very bottom, we can see that we have the one that I made, or the one that we ourselves manually made. I have my Pokemon app 001, which is the initial entry. The same thing here, 001 initial entry. And it was accepted. It came through okay. Well, now let's take a look at our database. When I run \d here, it went from having no relations to now having a list of relationships, starting with our auth group, all the way down to our Pokemon app. And then here we can see that here's our serial primary key, or the table that will take care of that for us. Well, now what about this Pokemon app? Let's select all from Pokemon app _ Pokemon. Here we can see we have 3 fields, ID, name, and level. Just like my model right up above, ID is assumed. And there's our name and our level being placed into our database. Does anyone have, oh, there we go. Go ahead, Donnie.
Yeah, real quick, not to like backtrack too far, but so I noticed, so we installed PsychoPG and I was just confused, like, where does it go? Like, do we have to manually add that to our requirements file now? Since like, would it automatically go in there?
No, yeah, that's a great question. So I made a new installation into my virtual environment, but how is that being tracked? It lives within my virtual environment. If I take a look here, I should see it now. So here I have Django, which was the original install. And then I see I have PsychoPG installed as well. But it's not being tracked anywhere. Well, I have to run the pip freeze command again manually. Requirements.txt. And now when I take a look at requirements.txt, it's actually tracking my virtual environment this time, and that's why it's a lot shorter. We can see that it only has my ASGIRF, Django, PsychoPG, SQL parse, and then a typing extension that's being utilized here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Any other questions regarding how to create a model and how to connect our app to our project and our project to our database? Go ahead, Jens.
So anytime that we want to make another model, say down the line in in a project where you decide, okay, let's make we want another table in our database. We just repeat those commands, right? The make, migrate, and then migrate.
Yeah, anytime. Perfect. Yeah, anytime you make a new model, you will want to make migrations and then migrate. Those migration files is what actually gets ran against your database, not the code that you wrote, but the migration files. Does that answer your question, Jens?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so for Flask, I had a port issue with one of the things that the Mac system was using. Would I need to change the port on Django, or does it use a different port by default?
Yeah, it's actually going to utilize a different port by default. I believe what you're talking about is for running the server, where Flask was trying to run on port 5500 or 5000. I can't remember which one of the two. And that's being utilized by some Mac OS systems. In this case, it's always going to run in port 8000 by default. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
Of course. Go ahead, Jens.
So following that, where can we go to specify the port that we want to use instead of the default port?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, we'll go over to our settings. And if you wanted to run some sort of specification here, like if you wanted to specify what the host name was, where the port was, you would just simply make new entries here saying host. I can make this localhost. I would then make another entry saying port, specify this as port 5432. And I could specify the user, which in this case, it should be Francisco Avila. And finally, I could specify a password if there is one. I don't have a password, so I don't need to. And this is how it would fall rather than doing it within the URI. Does that answer your question, Jens?
So this is for the database port. Is this also the same for the Django port?
Oh, I see. You're talking about the Django server. I apologize. Yeah, I'll be covering that here shortly. We're not quite there yet. I'll be covering that during part 2 of our lecture.
All right, thank you.
Of course. All right, everyone. Well, we created this instance, but how do I know this instance is working? Right? Or how do I know everything is working well in here and that I actually created the database and I can make database entries? Well, let's make an entry to Django, or let's make an entry through our database through Django. So what I'm going to do here is there's a difference between Python. If I run Python here, you can see that if I run Python, it takes me into a Python terminal where I can write Python code, right? I could say print Python, and it will actually print Python for me. Well, that's great. It works well, but that's not necessarily what I want, right? I want something that can actually grab this model and utilize everything that's going on within my project. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter Python, manage py, and I'm going to type in shell. So this is saying I want to enter a Python shell that works with Django. So when I run this, it's going to execute exactly as if it was just a regular shell, with the only difference being that I can actually grab the models that I've created within my file. So now I can say from Pokemon _ app.models, which is the file that I'm in. So I'm saying from the directory Pokemon app file models, I want to import Pokemon. And that works. If I were to run something that doesn't exist, it would give me a problem saying, hey, I can't do this. There's no such thing as Pokemons within this file. So I know that this import statement worked, or this import statement of Pokemon worked. But how do I actually create an instance of that Pokemon statement? Well, the instance of that Pokemon statement could be just as OOP, right? I can make a variable named Pikachu. And from there, I can grab the class Pokemon and I can make an instance where all I need is a name, which I'm going to make that name be Pikachu. And I'm going to make that level be equal to 12. This is just OOP. If I had a dictionary that I wanted to deconstruct, I could do it that way as well. If I wanted to not pass in this variable names equals to something, and I just wanted to pass in the arguments in order, I could do that as well. This is just the easiest way for us to visualize that I am storing within the variable Pikachu an instance of the Pokemon class where the attribute name will be Pikachu and the attribute level will be 12. So now when I execute this, we can see that it doesn't give me an error. And the last thing that I need to do is actually save this instance. All right, well, that instance has been saved. Let's go over to SQL and take a look at what happens when I run select all from Pokemon app. Well, now when I run this code, we can see that I have an entry of a Pokemon where the ID is 1, the name is Pikachu, and the level of said name is 12. So everything is working great. Well, how do I actually grab this Pokemon if I was in Python code? Well, just like before, what we saw in Flask, we would query the database, right? If I go into my backend server here in Flask and I pull up my app, when I grab my genre, I would query and grab all. The syntax is almost exactly the same when you're working with models in Django. The only difference is that instead of saying query, we're going to pass the objects argument. So we'll say Pokemon.objects, meaning all objects belonging to Pokemon, and I want to grab all of them. Well, when I run that command, I can see that I get a query set where it tells me that it is a list of objects of the class Pokemon. And in this case, this one is being referenced to as Pokemon object 1. All right. So we've just gone over how to create a project, can create an app, connect an app to said project, how to connect our project to PostgreSQL, creating a model, making migrations, and migrating into our database. And then after that, we covered how to create an instance of an actual model and save it into our database. Additionally, we covered dependencies and virtual environment. Does anyone have any questions over anything that was covered during part 1 of our lecture? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any questions, so let me go ahead and pause the recording here. All right, welcome back, everyone. So before we left, we covered creating a model, being able to make some database, some migrations, and then running our initial migration file into our database to actually create a data table with the correct name and fields. And then we logged into the Django shell to be able to create an actual instance of said object. So we have this information, everything's working great, but let's see what other things we have to offer as far as our object relational mapping so far. So let's expand on the Django object relational mapping. So more about fields. Fields are essentially all the parts and components that can create an object, right? And luckily in Django ORM, it provides us with some default fields that we can utilize to describe most components of an object in a deeper level. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, currently we can see all of these fields here, but let's take a look at the different fields that are provided within Django that we can utilize. And I wonder if I could go in here and let's see what we have. I don't need that. Okay, so here we go, fields. All right, so here's all the different fields that we can utilize. All right, so here we have an auto field, a blank choice dash. There's a huge list that we can look at, but what I want to focus on are the ones that we're going to be utilizing primarily. Obviously, we have our big integer field, which is kind of the same capabilities as the difference between integer and big integer, right? The difference is the amount of space it will occupy within the database and the amount of value that it can hold within the field. We have a binary field, the Boolean field, which we'll use a lot. It's just true or false, right? We have our character field, which we can specify how many characters. Again, the difference between varchar and char field. So if we come over here, we're using char field. That's always that char field is. Sorry, seems I have a hot mic. If anyone has their mic on, please go ahead and turn that off real quick. All right. So that char field is always going to default into an actual varchar. I'm sorry, everyone. It seems I've lost my. There it is. All right, that char field is always going to turn into an actual varchar within our database. So it's never going to occupy more space than it actually needs. Here we have a comma separated integer field. I've never actually utilized this, but I could see where that could be useful. We have a date field, which takes in just the date and nothing else. Kind of just how in SQL, we can create a date entry, right? But then we have this date time field. Now our date time field would be the equivalent of time zone. So that we can actually run this, enter both the date and the time zone. Then we have our decimal field, which we can utilize for money as long as we specify how many decimals places there will be. We don't have to specify the amount of integers that will be entered, just the decimal places. We have our email field, which comes pretty useful since it qualifies our emails. Then we have a file path field, which takes in obviously a file path. We have something for IP addresses. And Django's doing some sort of constraints in the background to make sure that all of these fields are receiving proper input. Let's see, what else do we have here? We have our positive integer fields. And then we have our text field. And we have some UIID and URL fields. So each one of these have their independent individual purpose, and they have their own constraints that come built into it so that we can make sure that we're receiving the right information within our database. So Django will not only will not only communicate with PostgreSQL, it also has some additional built-in constraints that it will run at the Django level before even trying to make database entry into PostgreSQL. So it makes all of its constraints, all of its checks, and make sure that they're at the Django level. Once they meet all of the requirements by Django, then Django goes into making sure that there's no sort of database query, right? So if it makes sure that there's no insertion or someone isn't trying to pass in values through a form that will manipulate my database. Typically, you have to build that yourself, or you have to use some sort of other framework to make sure that that doesn't happen. And it's a way of keeping your database secured. Well, Django does that for you. It checks each entry and it makes sure that each entry won't run some sort of SQL query within your database and protects your data. So that's all the other things that Django has to offer in this case. Now, knowing that, there's a couple of other things that we need to discuss about databases. As we know, everything is set to null unless specified that we don't want it to be nullable, right? So everything will default to null equals true, but that's not necessarily what you want. So here we can see a couple of things where null or blank are acceptable. Now, null and blank are completely different, all right? So blank means that you're still receiving input. It's just saving it as an empty string, right? Whereas null means that you're not receiving input and it's setting it to the equivalent of none in Python. So you can see this in our curriculum. The same chart is going to be there. I'm not going to read through each individual one of these fields and their pros and cons, but you can see how some fields are acceptable to be null, some fields are not acceptable to be none, and how each one of them could be set to true, depending on what it is that you're setting within your database. This table of recommendations is coming from 2 Scoops of Django. If you've read that book already, it's in our reading sources. You could go ahead and take a look. And they actually do a really great job at explaining why each one of these should be nullable or should not be accepting null values, should be blank or should not be accepting blank. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions about how we can improve our models or how we can utilize different kinds of fields within our independent model? Go ahead, Yams.
So in your school.db under models, if you want to change a field or if you want to add a field, when you migrate, does it automatically update that in the database?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's say I currently have a model, right? And I just wanted to add a field. So let's say that to my Pokemon, I wanted to add a field where I'm saying, hey, did I capture this Pokemon or is this Pokemon being captured? And when did that happen? Well, when I run that command, two things will happen. If I set it to null is equal to true, or I say that, hey, this is okay to be nullable, it's going to be able to accept that input. It'll generate more entries or the more fields inside of that Pokemon table, and it will give those prior entries the value of null for each one of those entries. Now, if any of those are not something that could be acceptable as null, then I have to specify some sort of default value that it can give to previous entries. Does that answer your question, Jens?
Yes, because I was wondering how you would handle the previous entries if it would be overwritten some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Any other questions? I apologize, everyone, making sure that I could see the Whiskey Questions channel as well, since there were some questions there that I didn't address in time. All right. Okay, well, if we have no other questions, let's start talking about something named fixtures. So just like we talked about, now that I know a little bit more about fields and things that I can do within my field, maybe I want to update my current Pokemon field. Well, what about the data that I already have? I don't want to just make updates without backing up my information or the current data that I have within my database, right? Because if I do make some sort of mistake or I do something that doesn't necessarily work with the current data I have, well, I don't want that data to then become corrupted and not be able to get it back. So I need to back it up in some sort of way. Later on, once we're utilizing something like AWS, we could definitely use AWS to dump our data into some sort of maybe a bucket, or you can, I'm pretty sure AWS has something that you can connect to PostgreSQL so that it's consistently backing up data every day. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it's just an extra service you have to pay for, which costs like $1. And it's able to just save all of your data and back it up for you so that if you ever run into some sort of problem with your database, your data is always being covered. But for us as developers, or even if I want to just send fake data over to another developer, I can dump the data that I currently have in my database, send it their way, and say, hey, here are the fixtures that I'm utilizing. This is the problem I'm encountering. I'm not sure what's going on. Or if I'm working with a front end team, I can tell them, hey, this is kind of what the database schema looks like. dump some fixtures and show them, hey, utilize this fixtures as a guide as to what you need in order to start building out your front end framework, right? Especially if we're both starting on a project, we don't want the front end to just stop and wait until we tell them exactly how our JSON responses are going to be looking like. We can just give them fixtures or start giving them information as we ourselves are building our database. So here we can see a pretty good example of what a fixture is. A fixture is essentially just a dummy data, right? So here we have SpongeBob on the left-hand side, which is our actual data, and then our fixture on the right-hand side, which is just our drawn out pencil SpongeBob. I forgot what its actual name is. Well, let's take a look at how we can put this into some practical application. So right now, I have my Pokemon data, which is my Pikachu, and I want to make some updates into it. Well, in order to make some updates into it, I have to make sure that my Pokemon is being saved correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and exit here. That's going to exit my Python shell. And I want to store the data within my database into a fixture for Pokemon. Well, I'm going to go ahead and run this Python manage py. That's going to reference to my project. And what I want it to do is I want it to dump data. And then it needs to know, well, what model is it that you want to dump data from? So I'm going to tell it, I want you to go into, sorry, I've been working on that assignment. I want you to go into the Pokemon app dot Pokemon. So inside of the Pokemon app, there's a model named Pokemon. And I want you to dump it. I'm going to pass in an argument. And actually, let me show it this way first. And I want you to dump it into Pokemon app slash fixtures slash Pokemon data dot JSON. Now, when I run this command, I see that I have an issue. It tells me, hey, there's no such file or directory named fixtures. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to make that directory inside of Pokemon app. I'm going to make a directory named fixtures. I don't have to create the file because the file will be generated for me by that command. So I run it again. Python manage py dump data inside of the Pokemon app. I want you to grab the Pokemon models data and I want you to dump it into this path. Okay, so we see that it worked now. And my fixtures directory now has a Pokemon data.json. When I click on this, we can see a representation in one individual line of my Pokemon. I can see the model, the model that it belongs to. It's the Pokemon within Pokemon app. The primary key is 1. And then it tells me the fields. The fields that I have are name and level, and it returns the actual values from the database. That's great, but we can see how it can become hard to read this information if it was a lot of entries into my database, right? It would all be stored in one single line and continue running all the way to the right. I don't necessarily need to be able to read this per se, but in the case that I did, I would want it to be in a nicer format. So there's a couple of extra arguments that we can pass in here. And I'm going to go ahead and pass in the same command. So Python manage py dump data Pokemon app dot Pokemon. And I'm going to pass in -- indent. I'm going to tell it that I want to indent down to the second level and that I wanted to dump this data within my Pokemon app inside of the fixtures directory in a file named Pokemon data.json. Now, when I execute this command, we're going to see this file change. So the command gets executed, and now we can see we have a list of objects. This JSON object still represents my Pokemon model, but now everything is indented to the second level so that I can actually see the field value pairs and be able to recognize each individual object and easily read through my data. Does anyone have any questions regarding how to create fixtures? Okay, perfect. There aren't any questions. So I was able to create a fixture, and now I can go and update my Pokemon. So now I'm going to come over to my Pokemon. I'm going to make a couple of new entries here. I want my Pokemon to have this level here, right? I have it defaulted to level F1, but I can also do something like date encounter, and I could do models dot date time field. I could utilize a date time field, but if I just want the date, then I could do something like date. Maybe I don't want the default. I could pass in a default. Why not? Let's give it a default value here. Let's say our default value, typically date fields, will take in something like YYY dash month dash day. So let's say that I want my date to be 2024 dash 03 dash 16. So there's my default value for my date. But what about my date captured? Again, I can make this a model, a date field, and I could pass in the same thing, right? I could pass in the same date, or maybe I want it to be 1 day later. But what if I wanted something a little bit different? What if I didn't just want to know when I captured the Pokemon or what date I captured the Pokemon, but I also wanted to know what time I captured the Pokemon. So I want something more like a timestamp. Well, in that case, I would utilize a date time field. Now, date time field expects a little bit of a different input. Let me see if I have it here. Doesn't seem like I do. I may have it here in the curriculum. There we go. It is in the curriculum. So datetime field expects something along the lines of the following format. Right, we can see there how it's specifying year, it's specifying month and day inside of my time. But it's also expecting hours, minutes, seconds, and I think that stands for milliseconds. All right, well, how can I mimic that? Maybe I want something to be a default of now. As soon as I make the entry, unless I specify a different value, I'm going to make it default to now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import from Django.utils. I'm going to import time zone. Oh, wow. There you go. So now I'm going to import time zone, and I'm going to utilize the current value of time zone, or the current .now, to be able to give that as a value. So now I'm going to say default is equal to time zone dot now. Do not call the function for time zone dot now. Just leave it that way. And whenever this entry comes in, it will actually call the method of now. Now, why am I utilizing something like time zone from Django.utils? So under the hood, datetime field is actually utilizing this time zone package. So if you try to utilize something else to enter time here by default, it may not return it in the correct format. It may throw a couple of errors. So it's important to utilize time zone. This is a common issue that students seem to run into when they're working with Django and utilize datetime field. So please ensure you annotate that you'll have to utilize time zone in order to give some sort of default value to datetime fields. Okay, great. Well, now that I've added that, what else could I add to my Pokemon? Well, I could give a small description of said Pokemon. This description may be small, it may be large, so I'm just going to give it a text field. And then finally, I'm going to give it a capture. In this capture status will be a models.boolean field, which I will default to false. and I will default to unknown. All right, so there's all of my Pokemon, or all the changes that I want to make to my Pokemon. Well, now that I've handled all of this information, how do I make this reflect into my database? Because currently nothing is reflecting into my database. So let me ask everyone this question. What file is it that actually executes SQL commands? The file that executes SQL commands is stored where and what is it called?
Is it migrations?
Awesome. Yeah, so if I take a look at migrations and I take a look at my initial migration, this is what's actually creating some SQL commands and being ran against my database. So knowing that, I know that I have to create a new migrations file. So I'm going to run Python, manage py, make migrations. And when I run this, we can see that there's been a couple of things added here. I have this added field, add field, added field, and one more added field. Well, I just realized as well, I have this level that's a models.integer field, but that means that somebody can put something like -1 or put in some other value that I don't necessarily want. So what about if instead of integer field, I run something like positive integer field, where the default value will be 1. Okay, well now if I run this make migrations one more time, okay, I also see that there is an alter field command for the level on Pokemon. Well, let's take a look at our migrations real quick. So we can see my initial migration remain the same. I have my create table. It's being ran. Here's my dependencies. It has none. And the initial value is set to true. Well, now if we go into 002, we'll see that initial value is gone. That initial attribute for the class migration is no longer there. And if we take a look at dependencies, it's saying, hey, you can't run this command until you execute Pokemon app 001 initial. And here are the operations that you're going to run. So it executes Pokemon app 001 initial. It adds the field to Pokemon where the name is captured. It is going to be a Boolean field. Again, it's going to add a field where the name is date captured, where it's going to take a date timestamp. One more field, date encountered, where it's going to take a date field. And finally, a field name description, where it's going to take text field. All right. Well, now let's take a look at 003. Well, now we can see that in date 003, it's saying that its dependency is 002. All right. And it runs the alter field for the Pokemon level, where it turns it into a positive integer. So this looks like a class instance, right? It looks like each one of these files is holding an instance where the next instance has a link to the previous one. What does that sound like from back in data structures week?
Linked lists.
Yeah, it sounds exactly like a linked list, right? So we can see how it's connecting to one another and how each one of these migration files is being created. But none of it has been ran against my database. If I run my select all from Pokemon, I still just have ID, name, and level. So now how do I run these migration files into my database? Go ahead, Jose.
Run the Python manage.py migrate command.
All right, so let's run migrate. And that is what's going to run my files into my database. And here we can see I apply the migrate command. Where'd it go? Where did you go? Here we are. So here's Python manage py migrate. The operations to perform, it's going to apply all migrations in the following apps. And here we can see that it's running the migrations from Pokemon app 002, and it was ran successfully. And then it ran the migration from Pokemon app 003, where it was ran successfully. So now if I take a look at my database and I select all from Pokemon, we can see that I still have Pikachu with this level 12, where the captured is false. Date captured, well, we gave it a date captured, so maybe we released it afterwards, and that's why it's false. And then we have a date encountered. And that's how you make updates to your database, handling JSON data. So now that I've made those updates to my database, I need to make sure that my fixture data is keeping track of the newest information. So again, I'm going to run Python manage py, dump data within my Pokemon app, the Pokemon model. I'm going to indent it by 2, and I'm going to dump it within my Pokemon app in fixtures in Pokemon data.json. And now if I take a look at my fixtures and I go into Pokemon data, we can see that the name, level, date encountered, date captured, description, and captured fields have been added into my JSON object. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over how to properly go about updating your fields or updating a model within your database through Django? Go ahead, Brian.
Hey, sir, in the model class definition for Pokemon, you showed us how to provide default values. And following the conversation about blank, true or false, or null being true or false, each of those fields has an automatic, blank is false and null is false because we didn't specify it, right? So each of those fields are required in so many words. And so if a user tries to create a new Pokemon object and omits, say, level, for example, in their Pokemon class creation, does that default equals 1 allow that creation to continue without throwing an error, even though it's required? Does that default kind of allow the Pokemon creation to proceed, even though the user didn't specify a level, because we provided that default? It's just going to say, okay, I know you didn't give me a level here, but since default's 1, we'll continue creating the Pokemon object with the value of 1 in level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that actually makes perfect sense. And that's actually exactly what would happen. So let's actually take a look at a pretty good example of how that works, right? Let's go ahead and enter the Python shell again. So Python manage py shell. And again, I'm going to import from Pokemon app.models. I want to import Pokemon. So we'll see that I don't get an error. So now I'm going to create a new instance of my class. Let's say Charizard is the next Pokemon that I want to add. I can say Pokemon here. And just like it was brought up earlier, right? There's default values that have been provided. So even if I said null is equal to false and I don't pass anything in here, then null means that it won't let anything into the database go in as null or as blank. But the default is what Python will accept before it actually runs an entry into the database. All right. So now I can create a Charizard if I just make name is equal to Charizard. I don't have to pass in any of the remaining arguments. Everything else already exists, or everything else already has a default value provided to it. So if I go ahead and run this here, we can see that it didn't make an error. I can say charizard.save. And now if I go into my database and I run select all from Pokemon, we can see that I have an entry for Charizard where all of the default values have been accepted and it created a new instance. Does that answer your question, Brian?
Yes, sir, 100%. Thank you. I know we're gonna get to full clean, but would full clean throw an error on that, or would full clean still allow that to proceed?
Yeah, full clean will allow it as well. Of
Thank you, sir.
course. All right. I see a question here on the chat from Nika. It's saying, is manage.py making all of these .py files like built-in version control for Django? Or should I just think about it like frames in a film or snapshots from a camera? I would think about frames from a field. Frames from a film. Whereas the next frame can exist without the previous frame. And I'm assuming you're referencing to the migration files. Is that correct, Nika?
Yes, sir, it is. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right. Awesome. Seems like there are no other questions. So let's take this model a step further now. So we've been able to add and make a couple of changes to our model, where now we have some fields, we have some field names, we're able to grab some default values, and we even changed one of our previously built fields, and we saw it turn into an alter table command. Well, now what else can we do with this model? Again, this model is just OOP, right? It's just a class. So currently, if I run this Pokemon.objects.all, I get two query sets where each representation of a Pokemon just says Pokemon Object 1 and Pokemon Object 2. But it doesn't tell me much else. Well, if I wanted to see a better representation of that, what could I add to this class that will show me more details about said Pokemon?
A string method?
Yeah, I could add a string method, a representation method. Let's go ahead and do the string method. So I'm going to go ahead and do def string, pass in self, because it's in reference to the class itself. And I'm going to return an f string of self.name. And then I'm going to say has been captured if self.captured, else is yet to be captured. All right. So now I have my string. I'm able to write some Python code, but this is all that's being returned within my representation method. Go ahead, Jose.
So your regular string has to be in curly braces as well.
My regular string has to be in curly braces. Are you referencing to this portion here?
Yes, right. So you have like an opening and a closing curly brace for that whole string.
Got it. So the reason why this is within string is because this isn't just string. This is actually a function, right? What I'm executing here is I'm evaluating if self.capture, it will return has been captured. Else, it's going to return is yet to be captured. If I wasn't running this if and else statement in there, I could just write it as regular string in here. But because I'm running an evaluation, I need it within those curly braces.
Okay, gotcha. Makes sense. Thank you.
Of course. All right, so now let's put this to practice. Let's go ahead and, oh no, what did I do here? Let me go back. All right, I'm gonna exit my Python shell because it's currently not tracking this change. I'm gonna enter my shell. And within my shell, I'm gonna go ahead and select objects. Oh, I'm gonna go ahead and bring in all of my Pokemon. So I imported Pokemon, and now I'm gonna grab all of them. So Pokemon.objects.all. Well, now we can see that the string method has taken effect. I can see query Pokemon Pikachu is yet to be captured. Pokemon Charizard is yet to be captured. And just like that, I added a string method into my Pokemon. Does anyone have any questions about how to add a string method into a Pokemon? Or into a class? All right, I don't see any questions. So let's go ahead and add a couple of other methods that may be useful for our project here. Well, we know a Pokemon can level up. So let's say that this Pokemon has a method named level up. It has in self, and all it does is it's going to say self.level plus equals 1. And then after that, we're going to save the Pokemon so that it goes into our entry. Let's run another one where we're going to create a Pokemon where I'm going to say change caught status. Again, it's going to reference self. And all this is going to do is that self.captured is equal to not self.captured. So if it is true, it's going to turn false. And if it is false, it's going to turn true. And then I'm going to save said instance. Now, these have nothing to do with the database. So I don't need to make migrations or migrate in order for my database to be able to work on this, because my database has no idea that these exist. I'm only going to run this within the Python shell again. So again, I'm going to Control C or exit my shell, because the version that I imported of my model into this shell did not know about the new 2 methods. So now I'm going to go ahead and enter the shell again, import my Pokemon, and I'm just going to query the database. I'm going to say Pikachu is equal to Pokemon.objects.first, because I know he's the first one in my database. And now I'm just going to simply run Pikachu. So there we go. We can see Pokemon Pikachu is yet to be caught. I grab the first instance within my database and I have Pikachu. Well, now everything is just like OOP. I can run Pikachu dot, and actually let's go ahead and look at Pikachu dot level real quick. We can see that he's level 12. Well, now if I run Pikachu dot level up and I check the level again, now we can see that Pikachu has a level of 13 because of this +1. All right. Well, now what if I wanted to change? And let's look at capture real quick. We can see that it's false. So now I'm just going to change capture status. So change caught status. And if I look at Pikachu.capture, now it says true. So now because it says true, I should say it, instead of getting Pikachu is yet to be captured, I should see Pikachu has been captured. So now I'll run Pikachu. There we see that the string method has changed. It's evaluating to has been captured. And if I take a look at my database, all of these changes should reflect. So here we see Pikachu, level 12. The capture is false. Well, now let's go ahead and select all from Pokemon where ID is equal to 1. We can see that Pikachu is now level 13, and its captured status is now set to true. And this is happening because of our methods that we've created within our class. All right, so this is all just OOP. There's a way to make inheritance happen within models as well. If you guys are interested in looking that up, the documentation is out there, but we will not be covering that during our material. Just know that everything that you can do within OOP also exists within Django models. Does anyone have any questions about models and their capabilities and limitations? All right. I'm not seeing any questions on the chat or here in the class. So the next thing I'm going to cover is going to be the Django admin site. So we've talked about the benefits of Django ORM, but what about the admin site? What is it about the admin site that really sticks out, or what is it that it brings into the benefit, or what is the admin site? So far we've been altering all of our models and making all of our changes to our models through our terminal. But Django actually provides a way for us to make all of our changes through a user-friendly kind of like GUI. So the first thing I have to do in order to enter this admin site is run my server. Well, let's go into running a server now. I'm going to go ahead and plug this in here. I'm going to escape. And I'm going to actually kill my SQL terminal because I don't need it. So now I'm going to go ahead and run the command Python manage py run server. I could run this server in other ports if I really wanted to. I could run something like port 8381, and it will then execute that on port 8381. All I need to do is after that run server command, I need to specify what port to run it on. And this is the equivalent as the app.run that we used with Flask. It's just now I'm utilizing a run server terminal command. So now I'm going to run its default value, which will be in port 8000. I'm going to go ahead and open this port. Well, now when I open that port, we can see that Django already has something to show us. So Django comes in and tells us my release notes for Django 5.0. It showed me that cool little rocket. We can see that a GET request has been received by my Django server and that it returned a response 200 OK. It gives me a couple of links, a tutorial that I can do to how to build my Django. And I can see that I have this debug equals true. And that's why I'm able to see this site. Okay, great. Well, what about the admin site? How do I enter that? Well, let's take a look at what Django has to offer for us. If I look at my project and I go to URLs, we can see I have this admin path that has been built in. Let me add that in there. I'm going to run admin. When I run that, it throws me into a Django administration, and it's asking me for a username and password. But I never made one of those, so I wouldn't be able to access my Django admin site. So let's take a step back and actually make a user. I'm going to kill my terminal, and I'm going to run Python manage py create super user. It's going to ask me for a name, an email. It doesn't actually check your email, so you could put whatever you would like. And then I put a really short password, so it's going to ask me to verify that that's what I actually want to use. And then I'm going to run my server one more time. All right, so now that user has been saved into Django. And it's actually being tracked by my Postgres database. Well, now let's go ahead and enter my username and my password. And great, now I'm inside of something that keeps tracks of groups and users. If I click on users, we can see that the username for FR, the email that I've created, has been inputted here. And now my Django application has a user. But what about the rest of my models? How am I able to alter my models through this Django admin site? Well, I'm going to open up my Pokemon app, and we can see this file here named admin.py. Well, the admin.py must connect to the admin site somehow. So if I go into admin, it tells me that I can register models here. So I'm going to go ahead and say from models, I want to import Pokemon. And upon importing Pokemon, I can go ahead and tell it that what I want to do is admin.site.register. And what it's going to register is my Pokemon model. All right, I'm gonna kill the server, run the server one more time. It's giving me an error saying no module named models, which is fair. I can go ahead and say dot models, and that will be able to run it. So now it's saying from this file named models, import Pokemon, and it's going to register into my site my Pokemon model. Well, now what happens when I refresh the site? Now I get a new field here named Pokemon app, and it has Pokemons within it. Well, now when I open it, it also gives me both of my entries for Charizard and Pikachu. If I click on Charizard, we can see that it gives me all of the information belonging to Charizard, the level, the date that it was encountered, the date captured along with the time, and a description here. Let's say Charizard looks like a dragon, but he's actually just the fire type in fire red. All right. So now I gave him a little bit of a description. Let's say I want to change him to being captured. And instead of my date encountered being the 16th, I want my date encountered to be the 11th. And instead of level 1, I'm going to make Charizard level 30. All right, so here's my Charizard Pokemon. And I've made a lot of changes into it. Well, now all I need to do is click here on save. It's going to save that information. We can see that my string method is what's being triggered here. That's why I see Charizard has been captured because of that dunder method that I've created. And now let's take a look at the database. I'm gonna kill my server, enter my Poke API database, and I'm going to select all from Pokemon app where ID equals 2. And now we can see that all the changes that I made are being reflected within my database. Here's Charizard, level 30, has been captured. My date captured has changed, or sorry, my date encountered has changed to the 11th. And we can see that Charizard looks like a dragon, but he's actually a fire type. All of the changes that I made within the Django administration site reflect inside of VS Code. And that's it. That's the magic of the Django ORM. There's a couple of other things that you can do, but that is all that we will be covering up to this point. Does anyone have any questions over anything that I covered today? And, oh, go ahead, Tyler.
I know this might be like a sidebar kind of sidetrack question, but where is like the HTML and everything for that site running? It's almost like full stack inception.
Yeah, no, that's great. So if we take a look at our apps here, let me go ahead and close all of this. So if I go to settings.py and I come over to my apps, we can see this app here saying django.contrib.admin. So there's an app that comes pre-installed with Django named admin. And within admin, there are templates, HTML, with CSS, and some JavaScript templates that actually run all the CRUDing operations, which is create, read, update, and delete for us. It has everything already pre-built for us to be able to track all of the different Pokemon that have been registered, all of the different models that we register, and run operations into that. And this is what really sticks out and one of the biggest power headers when it comes to the Django framework over other Python frameworks. Does that answer your question, Tyler?
Gotcha. Yeah. Yep. Thank you.
Always. All right. Any other questions? Okay, if there aren't any questions, let me go ahead and run a quick overview over what we've done today. Make this into a single table. All right, so today we've covered how to create a virtual environment and activate a virtual environment. Once we covered activating a virtual environment, we installed Django, and we covered the different ways of starting a Django project, one within a nested parent directory, and the other starting at the current directory that we were on. We then covered handling dependencies with requirements.txt, keeping track of only the virtual environment dependencies, how to install said dependencies when shared with other developers, and how to freeze our dependencies from our current pip. We then covered how to create a Pokemon app, connect the app into our project through settings, and connect our project to our database through settings. After that, we covered how to create our first Django model and how our Django model create migration files. And migration files run against the database to actually do SQL queries, which will create a table or alter a table. We expanded upon our models to fully understand the capabilities and limitations of what a model inside of our Django ORM has to offer. We explored the Django Python shell, and then we explored the Django admin site. And we also covered how to create fixtures to back up our data before running any sort of project or any sort of update to our Django models. Does anyone have any questions regarding all the topics that we covered today? All right, if there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.